In the spring of 1834, somewhere in the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would forever change how we understand the depths of human evil. 47 children, ages ranging from 6 to 16, were found chained in a basement beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse. The children bore no resemblance to each other, spoke different languages, and when questioned, could only whisper one name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. The local sheriff's report, buried for over a century in the Henrico County archives, describes scenes so disturbing that 3 of the investigating officers resigned from duty within a week. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horror of what was found, but the chilling realization that Constance Sullivan had been operating her twisted enterprise for over 2 decades without detection. The children called her Mother, but the truth behind that title would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Sullivan family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to perplex historians today, is how such a massive operation could have gone undetected for so long in a close-knit rural community. The Virginia of 1834 was a land caught between 2 worlds. The old plantation system still dominated the social landscape, while whispers of industrial change drifted down from the north. In this environment, the small farming community of Millbrook, a collection of perhaps 50 families spread across the gentle slopes of Henrico County, represented the typical American rural settlement of the era. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn, traded at Henderson's general store, and gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a community meeting hall. The Sullivan property sat on the outskirts of this community, a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse surrounded by nearly 200 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dusty road that connected Millbrook to Richmond, the Sullivan farm appeared utterly unremarkable. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1810s, featured white-painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch typical of Virginia architecture. A red barn stood 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and smokehouse completing the typical farmstead layout. What made the Sullivan property unique wasn't visible from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who had purchased the land in 1809 with money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, had spent considerable effort expanding the house's basement. While most Virginia homes of the period featured simple root cellars, the Sullivan basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen remembered being hired for various excavation projects throughout the 1810s and 1820s, though none had seen the completed work. Ezra paid well and in cash, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall project. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a bride of 22. Neighbors remembered her as a handsome woman with dark hair and an unusually soft voice. She dressed simply but neatly, attended the Methodist church services when health permitted, and maintained a reputation for charitable works. When approached about contributing to community causes, Constance would inevitably explain that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. The arrangement, she explained, was temporary, just until suitable permanent homes could be found. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional glimpses of children around the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson at the general store would sometimes see a young face peering from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would explain that they were shy, traumatized by the loss of their parents, and needed time to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, familiar with the tragedy of orphaned children in an era of high mortality rates, accepted these explanations without question. Thomas Henderson, who ran the general store, later recalled that Constance Sullivan was one of his most reliable customers. Every 2 weeks, she would arrive with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase substantial quantities of basic foodstuffs: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and other staples. The quantities seemed large for a childless couple, but when Thomas mentioned this, Constance would remind him about the orphaned children. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from poor circumstances often arrived with various ailments that required treatment. The Sullivan farm operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families rose with the sun and worked until dusk, activity at the Sullivan property often continued well into the evening. Lights could be seen in the farmhouse windows at unusual hours, and the sound of hammering or construction work sometimes echoed across the fields during the night. When asked about these activities, Ezra would explain that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the Millbrook area, remembered being called to the Sullivan farm on several occasions during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time he was told that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and needed medical attention. However, Dr. Whitfield was never permitted to examine the children directly. Instead, Constance would describe the symptoms and request specific medications. When the doctor insisted on seeing his patients, Constance would explain that the children were too frightened of strangers, too traumatized by their experiences to allow examination by unfamiliar men. The deception was so complete that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed in the Sullivan family's charitable work. During his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews would praise Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphans, but Constance would always explain that she was already in correspondence with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually take the children. The process, she assured him, simply required patience and careful arrangement. What none of the community members realized was that Constance Sullivan had been perfecting her deception for over 2 decades. The orphaned children were not temporary residents awaiting placement with loving families. They were prisoners, purchased, kidnapped, or lured from their families across multiple states, held in conditions that would make hardened criminals weep with horror. The discovery that would expose the Sullivan family's horrific secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1834. February had been unusually harsh, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. The bitter cold that gripped Virginia that winter would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Sullivan farm, being the closest building visible from the road, seemed like a natural choice for emergency accommodation. Ezra Sullivan, despite his obvious reluctance, could hardly refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler during such dangerous weather. Stern later described the evening as uncomfortably tense. Constance Sullivan served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but conversation was stilted and awkward. The Sullivans seemed nervous, constantly exchanging glances and starting at every sound. When Stern asked about the children he had been told lived on the farm, Constance explained that they were all sleeping and mustn't be disturbed. The children, she said, had been ill with fever and needed their rest. What disturbed Stern most was the sound. Throughout the night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor, he could hear what sounded like muffled crying coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned this to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan claimed it was probably just wind whistling through gaps in the foundation. The sound was common in old houses, especially during cold weather. Stern accepted this explanation, but something about the Sullivans' manner continued to trouble him. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family to seek work in the tobacco fields around Richmond, became separated from their group during a river crossing. Exhausted and frightened, she made her way to the Sullivan farm as darkness fell. Constance Sullivan took her in, offering food and shelter for the night. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her family reported her missing to the sheriff in Richmond, they described their last known location and the direction Mary Catherine had been heading. A search party was organized, but the vast expanses of Virginia wilderness made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. The search was called off after a week, and Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed to have died of exposure or been killed by wild animals. The final incident that would lead to the discovery occurred on April 2, 1834. A local farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits in the woods that bordered the Sullivan property when he heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere near the Sullivan farmhouse came the sound of children screaming. Not the ordinary cries of youngsters at play, but raw, desperate shrieks of pure terror. Hutchinson crept closer to investigate, hiding behind a stand of oak trees about 50 yards from the Sullivan house. For nearly an hour, he watched and listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house rather than from inside it. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door on the side of the house. Sullivan looked around nervously, then disappeared back underground. When Hutchinson reported what he had witnessed to his neighbors, opinions were divided. Some suggested that the orphaned children might be more troubled than the Sullivans had indicated, perhaps requiring discipline or medical treatment that could be distressing. Others, however, began to remember odd details that hadn't seemed important before. The unusual amounts of food Constance Sullivan purchased, the strange sounds neighbors occasionally heard at night, the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen in town or at community gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman who had served Henrico County for over 15 years, initially dismissed the concerns as neighborhood gossip. However, when William Hutchinson approached him directly and insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to investigate. The law required him to follow up on reports of potential child abuse, regardless of his personal opinion of the accusers. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm, accompanied by his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived just after sunrise, expecting to conduct a routine inspection that would put the community rumors to rest. Constance Sullivan met them at the door, her manner calm and welcoming. She invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed concern about the gossip circulating in the community. The conversation began normally enough. Constance explained again about the orphaned children, showed the officers letters she claimed to have received from relatives in Pennsylvania, and offered to arrange for the children to meet with Sheriff Crawford once they recovered from their recent illness. Everything seemed perfectly reasonable until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door that William Hutchinson had seen Ezra Sullivan using was secured with 3 separate padlocks. Heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, and the wood around the locks showed signs of desperate clawing, as if someone had tried to scratch their way out from the inside. When Webb returned to the house and quietly informed Sheriff Crawford about what he had observed, both men knew they were dealing with something far more serious than community gossip. Crawford politely asked Constance to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would help put the rumors to rest. The change in Constance Sullivan's demeanor was immediate and chilling. Her face went pale, her hands began to tremble, and she began stammering about how the cellar was dangerous, how the children weren't allowed down there, how there was nothing to see but old farm equipment and storage. That was when they heard it. From somewhere beneath their feet came the sound of children crying, followed by a weak voice calling for help. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it was coming from directly below the kitchen where they stood. The immediate aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb forced open the cellar door, the stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming. A mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 2 decades constructing was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The main chamber stretched far beyond the footprint of the house above, extending into the earth like an underground warren. Stone walls, carefully mortared and designed to muffle sound, created a series of interconnected rooms. The largest chamber, directly beneath the kitchen, housed most of the children. They were chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, each child secured by shackles around their ankles. The chains were long enough to allow movement within a small area, but prevented any possibility of escape. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 16 years old. They were emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, their bodies bearing the marks of prolonged neglect and abuse. Many showed signs of illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that came from living in the damp, unventilated underground space. What struck both officers most forcefully was the silence. After the initial cries for help, the children said nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to leave the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford, despite his years of law enforcement experience, found himself unable to process the full scope of what he was seeing. The methodical nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of long-term planning, the sheer number of victims. It was beyond anything in his experience or imagination. In the smaller chambers, Crawford and Webb found evidence of the Sullivan system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining devices for punishment. Another held what appeared to be a primitive medical area where the children were treated for injuries and illnesses, not out of compassion, but to keep them alive and functional. A third room contained detailed records that would prove crucial to the investigation. Names, ages, dates of arrival, and notes about each child's condition and behavior. The records revealed the scope of the Sullivan operation. Children had been arriving at the farm regularly since 1812, shortly after Constance Sullivan came to Millbrook. The sources varied. Some were orphans purchased from overwhelmed poorhouses. Others were runaways lured by promises of food and shelter, and still others appeared to have been simply kidnapped from their families. The record showed that over the years, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement. The obvious question, what had happened to the others, was answered in the most horrifying way possible. In a separate chamber, reached through a narrow passage that required crawling. Crawford and Webb found the remains of at least 36 children. Some appeared to have died from illness or malnutrition. Others showed signs of violence. All had been buried in shallow graves beneath the basement floor, their bodies covered with lime to control odor and decay. The investigation that followed the initial discovery would continue for months, as authorities struggled to understand how such a massive criminal enterprise had operated undetected for over 2 decades. The answer lay in Constance Sullivan's genius for deception and her understanding of human psychology. She had created a persona that was almost perfectly designed to avoid suspicion in a rural 1830s community. The character of the charitable woman caring for orphaned children appealed to the community's Christian values while explaining away any unusual aspects of the Sullivan household. The story of traumatized children who were too frightened to interact with strangers provided a ready excuse for why the supposed orphans were never seen in public. The claim that permanent homes were being arranged with distant relatives explained why the children never seemed to leave the farm. Even more cleverly, Constance had created multiple layers of protection for her operation. The children were taught to call her mother, ensuring that if anyone ever overheard them, it would seem like a natural family relationship. The few times children had been glimpsed by outsiders, they had been carefully coached to remain silent and appear shy rather than terrified. The substantial food purchases were explained by the presence of multiple children, while the medical supplies were justified by the supposed poor health of orphaned youngsters. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The basement construction had been spread over many years, with different workers handling different aspects of the project. No single craftsman had seen the complete layout or understood the true purpose of the modifications. The soundproofing was effective enough that even close neighbors rarely heard anything suspicious, and when they did, the sounds could be explained as ordinary farm activities or the normal noise of children playing. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological control system that Constance had developed. The children were told that they had been abandoned by their families, that no one was looking for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and hostile. Those who behaved properly were given slightly better food and living conditions. Those who caused trouble were subjected to punishments that served as examples to the others. Over time, most of the children accepted their captivity as simply the way their lives were meant to be. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete shock and disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Constance Sullivan, the quiet woman who had lived among them for over 20 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that she must have been coerced by her husband, or that the whole situation was somehow a misunderstanding. These denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged. The detailed records found in the basement included not just information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other states. Constance Sullivan had been part of a network that trafficked in children, buying and selling young victims across state lines. The Sullivan farm was just one operation in a larger criminal enterprise that stretched from Pennsylvania to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford delved deeper into the Sullivan case, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested the operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The correspondence found in the basement revealed that Constance Sullivan had been in regular contact with at least 12 other individuals across 5 states, all apparently involved in similar activities. The letters, written in a simple code that was eventually deciphered, discussed merchandise, deliveries, and quality control in language that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, dated just 3 months before the discovery, came from someone identified only as A. Morrison in Philadelphia. Morrison wrote that he had 6 new items of varying ages and conditions that would be suitable for your requirements. The letter included detailed descriptions of the children, their approximate ages, and their physical conditions. Most disturbingly, it included notes about their temperaments, which children were compliant and which might require additional training. The financial records painted an even more horrifying picture. Constance Sullivan had been paying between $50 and $200 per child, depending on age and condition. She had also been receiving payments from other locations, suggesting that the Sullivan farm served as both a destination and a distribution point for trafficked children. The total amount of money involved was staggering for the time period. Over $8,000 in transactions over 2 decades, equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had been called to the Sullivan farm on several occasions, became a key witness as the investigation expanded. Under questioning, he revealed that Constance Sullivan had always been unusually specific about the medications she requested. She had detailed knowledge of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other conditions common in severely neglected children. She had also asked for sedatives and other drugs that could be used to control difficult prisoners. The doctor's testimony led to another chilling realization. Constance Sullivan had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medical supplies she purchased, the questions she asked, even the layout of the basement, everything was designed to maximize the survival rate of her prisoners while minimizing the resources required to maintain them. Local businessman Thomas Henderson provided additional pieces of the puzzle. A review of his sales record showed that Constance Sullivan had been purchasing increasing quantities of basic supplies over the years. What appeared to be the growing needs of a charitable household was actually evidence of an expanding criminal operation. Henderson also remembered specific requests for items that seemed unusual at the time. Extra blankets, large quantities of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of simple medicines. The investigation also revealed the role of Ezra Sullivan in the operation. While Constance appeared to be the mastermind, Ezra was responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison and the handling of the children. Several of the surviving victims, when they were finally able to speak, described him as the enforcer who carried out punishments and maintained discipline. His construction work on the basement hadn't been just expansion. It had been constant refinement of a system designed to hold human beings in captivity. The most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the records of children who had disappeared from the Sullivan farm over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations, suggesting a network of buyers and sellers across multiple states. Others had been marked as unsuitable or problematic, entries that corresponded with the remains found in the basement burial chamber. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities in other states began examining their own unsolved disappearances. Missing children reports from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina showed disturbing similarities. Many of the missing children fit the profile of those found at the Sullivan farm, poor, orphaned, or from families that were unlikely to have resources to search for them extensively. Federal marshals were called in to coordinate the multi-state investigation. This was unprecedented for the time period, as most law enforcement was strictly local. The Sullivan case represented one of the first major criminal investigations to cross state lines and involve federal authorities. The legal implications were complicated by the fact that many of the crimes had occurred in different jurisdictions under different laws. As weeks passed, more survivors began to tell their stories. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and psychological manipulation. The children described how new arrivals were broken in, subjected to isolation, punishment, and indoctrination until they accepted their fate. They spoke of a complex hierarchy among the prisoners, with older children given minor privileges in exchange for helping to control younger ones. The survivors also revealed the extent of Constance Sullivan's psychological manipulation. She had convinced many of the children that they were worthless, that their families had sold them or abandoned them, and that they deserved their treatment. Some of the older children, who had been imprisoned for years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was even more dangerous than their captivity. The investigation uncovered evidence of Sullivan's methods for acquiring victims. She had developed relationships with corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who would provide children in exchange for payments. She had also cultivated contacts among criminal elements in major cities who could identify vulnerable children, runaways, street orphans, and others who wouldn't be missed immediately. Perhaps most chillingly, the records showed that the Sullivan operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children being held had increased, and there were plans in the correspondence for establishing similar facilities in other locations. The discovery at the Sullivan farm had apparently interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming a much larger operation. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete exposure of the Sullivan network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was a girl named Rebecca, approximately 14 years old, who had been held longer than any of the others. Unlike the other children who had been broken by their ordeal, Rebecca had maintained a spark of defiance and an extraordinary memory for details. Rebecca had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829 when she was just 9 years old. She remembered everything about her capture. How a woman claiming to be a distant relative had arrived at their farm, how she had been lured away with promises of sweets and a ride to town, how she had awakened chained in the Sullivan basement. More importantly, she remembered every conversation she had overheard between Constance Sullivan and the various visitors who had come to the farm over the years. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation was just one part of a much larger network. She had heard Constance discussing other farms, other locations where children were being held. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between different facilities. Her information provided law enforcement with their first comprehensive picture of the scope of the criminal enterprise. The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described a visit that had occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man had arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 other men. Rebecca had been selected, along with 3 other children, to be inspected by the visitors. The man had examined them carefully, checking their teeth, their muscle tone, and their general health like a buyer evaluating livestock. The visitor had ultimately decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too damaged for his purposes. However, he had left behind a letter containing detailed specifications for the type of children he wanted to purchase. The letter, which was found among Constance Sullivan's papers, described requirements for children of specific ages, physical characteristics, and temperaments. The language was cold and businesslike, discussing human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The letter was signed H. Blackwood and included a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities investigated, they discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been purchasing children for years, ostensibly as household servants, but actually for purposes that the investigation would reveal to be even more sinister than the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection opened up an entirely new dimension of the case. Southern plantation owners, it appeared, had been using the child trafficking network to acquire workers who would be completely under their control. Unlike enslaved people who had some legal protections and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death with no legal consequences. They had no families to search for them, no legal status to protect them, and no hope of escape. The investigation of the Blackwood connection revealed that several other prominent Southern families had been involved in similar purchases. The children were being used not just as laborers, but as subjects for medical experiments, as targets for violent entertainment, and for purposes that the investigators found too disturbing to document fully in their official reports. As the scope of the criminal network became clear, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families involved in purchasing children had significant political connections and substantial resources to protect themselves. Threats began to be made against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home from work. Dr. Whitfield found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by several prominent patients. The pressure was clearly designed to intimidate law enforcement and prevent the full extent of the network from being exposed. The situation became even more dangerous when one of the surviving children, a boy named Timothy, who had been providing crucial testimony, disappeared from the temporary shelter where he was being housed. A search was conducted, but Timothy was never found. The message was clear: those who cooperated with the investigation would face severe consequences. Despite the intimidation, the investigation continued. Federal marshals provided additional security for key witnesses and investigators. The surviving children were moved to more secure locations, and armed guards were posted at the Sullivan farm to protect the physical evidence. The case had become a test of whether the American legal system could function when confronted with crimes involving wealthy and powerful perpetrators. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan herself was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious. Sullivan had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the criminal network, including the names of all her contacts and customers. Her death eliminated the investigation's most important witness and source of information about the broader conspiracy. The mysterious death of Constance Sullivan sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved in the case was safe. The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise so vast and so well connected that it posed a threat to some of the most prominent families in American society. Just when it seemed that the investigation might be derailed by intimidation and violence, an unexpected development changed everything. A former employee of Henry Blackwood, motivated by guilt over what he had witnessed, came forward with evidence that would blow the case wide open. The employee, a man named Samuel Pierce, had worked as an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and had detailed knowledge of the children who had been purchased from the Sullivan network. Pierce brought with him documents that proved the connection between the Sullivan operation and the Southern buyers. More importantly, he had witnessed the fate of many of the children who had been sold to plantation owners. His testimony would provide the final pieces of the puzzle and expose the full horror of what had been happening to America's most vulnerable children. Samuel Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond would go down as one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. Pierce, a man in his 40s with weathered hands and haunted eyes, had worked for Henry Blackwood for over a decade. What he had seen on the Blackwood plantation and what he revealed about the fate of the Sullivan children shocked even the seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the scope of the criminal enterprise. Pierce described how the Blackwood plantation operated two separate systems. The main plantation used enslaved labor for cotton production, operating under the typical, though brutal, economic model of Southern agriculture. However, Blackwood had also established what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where the trafficked children were held for purposes that had nothing to do with agricultural production. The children purchased from the Sullivan network were used as subjects for medical experiments that Blackwood conducted with several associates, including 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College. The experiments were designed to test the limits of human endurance, to study the effects of various drugs and treatments, and to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children as laboratory animals rather than human beings. Pierce's most damning testimony concerned the detailed records that Blackwood maintained of these experiments. The plantation owner had documented everything: the children's reactions to different treatments, their survival rates under various conditions, and the progression of diseases that were deliberately introduced to study their effects. The records showed that Blackwood and his associates had been conducting systematic torture disguised as medical research. The testimony revealed that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood over the years. Of these, only 4 had survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers. The rest had died as a result of the experiments, malnutrition, or the brutal working conditions in the experimental quarters. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the plantation. Pierce also provided information about the broader network of buyers. He had been present at meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and even some politicians. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the entire country, with different buyers having different requirements and purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Pierce described a gathering he had witnessed in the fall of 1833. Blackwood had hosted what he called a demonstration for potential buyers from across the South. The event was designed to showcase the quality of the children available through the network and to demonstrate the various uses to which they could be put. Pierce's description of this gathering was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury had to leave the room. The demonstration had included displays of the children's ability to perform various types of work, their responses to different forms of punishment and control, and their suitability for different types of exploitation. The buyers had been encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, business-like atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scope of the network. The prices paid for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children who could be more easily controlled and conditioned commanded higher prices. Children with specific physical characteristics or abilities were sold at premium rates. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune for the time period. The investigation team used Pierce's information to coordinate raids on multiple locations across the South. Federal marshals working with local law enforcement simultaneously struck at plantations, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 100 additional children were rescued from various locations. Physical evidence was seized that documented the full extent of the trafficking network, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases and sales. Several prominent individuals were arrested, including Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, and a state legislator from Georgia, who had been one of the network's best customers. The evidence seized during the raids painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked the nation. The trafficking network had been operating for over 30 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized hundreds of children. The level of organization and sophistication was unprecedented for any criminal enterprise of the time period. The medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his associates were documented in horrifying detail. The record showed that the experimenters had deliberately infected children with diseases to study their progression, had tested various poisons and toxins, and had conducted surgical procedures without anesthesia or proper medical training. The children had been treated as disposable research subjects, their lives valued only for the scientific knowledge that could be extracted from their suffering. The investigation also revealed the corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments had been bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or to approve adoptions that were actually sales. Even some law enforcement officials had been involved in covering up evidence and intimidating witnesses. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years, as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that had occurred across multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of many of the defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the trafficking network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Sullivan case became a catalyst for the first federal legislation addressing child trafficking and abuse. It led to reforms in the oversight of orphanages and poorhouses, and to the establishment of new legal protections for vulnerable children. The final resolution of the Sullivan case would take nearly 5 years to complete, but its impact on American society was immediate and profound. The public reaction to the revelations was one of horrified fascination mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many publications dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The surviving children faced a long and difficult path to recovery. Most had been held for years and had no memory of life before their captivity. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement required extensive medical treatment, psychological care, and patient work to help them readjust to normal human interaction. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose testimony had been crucial to exposing the broader network, became something of a celebrity as news of her courage spread. However, the attention proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania who provided the quiet, supportive environment she needed to heal. Rebecca lived to be 73 years old, eventually marrying and raising a family of her own, but she never spoke publicly about her experiences again after the trial testimony. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking network. Ezra Sullivan, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836, before a crowd of over 3,000 people. His last words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. Henry Blackwood's trial became a sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of Southern plantation society. The medical records seized from his plantation provided evidence of systematic torture and murder that shocked even hardened observers. Blackwood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years by appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1841, reportedly of a heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets. The two physicians from Charleston Medical College who had participated in the experiments were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their cases led to new regulations governing medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself faced a scandal that nearly resulted in its closure, as investigators revealed that several other faculty members had knowledge of the illegal experiments but had failed to report them. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that didn't reflect the severity of their crimes. A state legislator from Georgia who had been one of the network's major customers was censured by his legislature but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the trafficking network had generated enormous profits for its organizers. Constance Sullivan alone had accumulated over $12,000 in profits over her 20-year operation, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Sullivan farm itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in a place associated with such evil. The house was demolished in 1845, and the basement was filled with concrete and sealed permanently. A small cemetery was established on the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. The case led to significant reforms in child welfare and protection. Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Sullivan case had demonstrated the limitations of state-by-state law enforcement when dealing with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New federal statutes gave marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing precedents that would prove crucial in later criminal justice developments. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the need for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for orphaned children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase, "another Sullivan case," entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Sullivan operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the rest of his career to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children, and became an advocate for reforms in medical practice that would prevent physicians from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were influenced heavily by his experience with the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for decades. Crawford's detailed reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for law enforcement officers across the country. The children's stories, as they emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to build relatively normal lives with proper support and care. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and other problems that stemmed from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered at all, dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Sullivan basement contained references to other operations, other victims, and other perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Sullivan operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other parts of the country, that children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history, and that the legal and social systems had been inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Millbrook, who had lived for 20 years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious? These questions led to broader discussions about the obligation of communities to watch out for their most vulnerable members. The Sullivan case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled abuse, and of assuming that respectable appearances guaranteed moral behavior. The legacy of the Sullivan case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, financial records, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations, using it to understand how systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities. In the end, the Sullivan family's reign of terror was brought to an end not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore obvious signs of trouble. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Rebecca's determination to testify despite her trauma. These individual acts of moral courage were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The basement, where 47 children were found chained, has been sealed for over a century. But the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has given you chills, you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in places like the Sullivan farm intensifies our understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other secrets lie buried in America's past. This mystery shows us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who appear most normal to their communities. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the Virginia hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of American history has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video.